Hey there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Peep into Education. I'm Kylie Elizabeth, also known as the Virtuoso Educator. And on this next episode today, I have with me Diana Williams, who's coming from Brooklyn, New York. Diana is a former elementary school teacher, and she focuses on special education. And she is now a consultant and has her own businesses that support the special education world. And I'm going to bring her in today. We're going to have some discussions on special education as well as our family environment and engagement. So I'm excited to have this conversation with her today. All right. Hi there. How you doing, Diana? Thank you for joining me.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. And just so the viewers know, today is Super Bowl Sunday, so me and Diana decided to make sure we watch the Usher performance, so that was fun. So we gonna switch our brains back into work mode here a little bit. But again, thank you so much for joining me and for your patience. We gotta love technology because I was having some tech issues earlier today. So I have Diana Williams here again. I'm gonna allow obviously you to have discuss about you and just share a little bit about your background and what you're currently doing, and then we'll get going into our conversation.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to engage in this conversation with you. I got started in education as a Teach for America alum, or core member rather, in 2015, where I worked as an elementary school teacher in Camden, New Jersey. And so after working there for a few years, I relocated to Brooklyn, New York, where I transitioned into special education administration. And throughout my career, I've worked at charter schools, but specifically, I worked at the first school overseeing special education compliance and also assessments. And then I had the great opportunity to co-found a charter elementary school in Brooklyn, New York, where I have served in various positions from covering classrooms as teachers to the dean of student support, interim principal for a little while, and then assistant head of school until I transitioned in this last school year, where I transitioned to another charter organization, now as the assistant director of special education over several elementary schools. And so, in addition to my full-time job, I also have a special education consulting business where I work with leaders and educators throughout the country to increase their special education knowledge, capacity, and just overall impact within their roles.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much for introducing all of that. And just like all of us are in this fun world that we are in the world of education, we do and wear so many hats. So I just want to kind of back up to the first thing you mentioned. So you talked about Teach for America. So a lot of viewers may not know what Teach for America is. Do you mind elaborating a little bit on that and maybe a little bit of your experience from being in that program?
Definitely. So Teach for America is sort of like a job training middleman program. That's how I like to explain it to folks. They recruit people that are still in college, that are leaving college, but also career changers who want to enter the education field. And so they provide us with a series of trainings through the summer and the school year to just best set us up for support at our placement schools, where we then work for the next 2 years. And so after you graduate or complete your 2-year commitment, then you're part of the alumni ship, where you just are able to keep your network, engage in additional professional development opportunities and things like that.
Awesome. Yeah, and Teach for America is in every state, so you guys can look that up their website. You'll be able to find out information. But yes, that transition good it's a good resource to use. Thank you for sharing that. And how why special education? Like what moved you into that direction after while working with elementary students?
Definitely. I mean, I feel like my journey into special education is very similar to my journey into education in general, kind of just a happenstance. And put into classrooms, put in positions where we're trying to figure out how to best support the students that we're serving, to ensure that they get the proper academic support, related service support. And it really tied into when I went to undergrad, I actually majored in public health and sociology. And the sociology part of it is what really interests me, of understanding why people do the things that they do in the different communities and such. And so that kind of set a foundation, unbeknownst to me, for my passion and work further in special education. And so since I've started, being placed in an inclusion classroom, I've realized that there's just a lot of needs within our students and within our classrooms that aren't easily met through tier 1 instruction. And so it really requires educators to be knowledgeable about how to best serve them so that they have access to the material and they can have just academic success within schools.
Nice. So as far as the tiers, I know what the tiers are. Can you explain what tier 1 means a little bit and what the other tiers are?
Yes. So typically people are familiar with the response to intervention tiered pyramid, where tier 1 is something that all students get throughout a school, whether it's it could be whole class instruction, it could be whole school behavioral or discipline programs that basically meet the needs of the majority of students. Then you have tier 2 instruction or behavioral supports, which are providing more tailored small group intervention services for students that need what everyone else gets, plus a little bit more. And then finally, you have tier 3, which is the most intensive support available, whether it's academics or behaviorally, to say that we need to come up with a specific and tailored program to meet the unique needs of these students.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And kind of, I know from what I've witnessed as being an educator, especially with elementary students, a lot of parents don't realize what tiers their students actually fall into. And so that comes a lot when it comes to parent engagement and involvement into schools, and definitely advocating to understand, what levels of support is your child getting in. And usually schools do send out the information to indicate, hey, your child may need an additional level of support, either based off of, standardized testing or other assessments that are taken within the classroom. But then that does kind of categorize them by, I wouldn't say learning style, but academic levels around reading and math. And so while you have been working in the field of special education and you offering your services, through your coaching, what are some strategies that you offer, or what have you found to be most effective in the methods that you use in your classes or with those that you coach?
Definitely. So as of late, I've worked with several schools specifically on strengthening the tier 1 instruction. So in this post-COVID world, if we may, we have seen students with greater challenges and greater needs than we had in the pre-COVID world. And so as a result, we want to look at tier 1 instruction at the root and foundation to figure out and make sure that teachers are executing high quality lessons and instruction. Sometimes schools fall into the trap of figuring out, how are we differentiating? How are we doing small group? Where first we need to start at the root of the problem, which is the tier 1 instruction. And so working with schools right now to implement universal design learning, which is UDL strategies, to meet the needs of diverse learners. Things like that. I think something else that has been a recent challenge of schools is, since COVID, a lot of educators, both teachers and leaders, have left the field. And so now we have a lot of career changers and new to education folks that are leading classrooms, which is a great thing. But now we need to equip them with the skills in order to be successful and effective for our students.
Absolutely. And yes, that's a huge topic. Like you said, a lot of people have left. I think a lot were leaving prior, but the pandemic has definitely exacerbated people's time and energy and patience and so much things that we all kind of faced through that time. And so, yes, if you are not aware of that, the education field is dwindling with teachers. One, because those are leaving that don't want to deal with the changes or the behavioral changes that have heightened in the school settings, or we're not getting new teachers, or those that are not interested in entering the field because they hear the negativity of the role or the income, or all of those things, which we can discuss in another conversation. But it's so important, as you discussed, to for those that are not from a formally trained background in education, or if they're brand new kind of coming in at this time of the season of education, to really have that understanding of whole group instruction, and teaching to the classes, to the full class, and not having to lean on differentiated learning or small group instruction. So that's really important. One thing I noticed kind of going through your LinkedIn account, so everybody, she's on LinkedIn under her name, Diana R. Williams. And so on there, you talk a lot about inclusive practices, and I liked how you said, turning it from good to great. So can you give us an idea, an example for those that don't know what inclusive practices look like? And, in your opinion, what is something that is good that we could turn to great?
Definitely. So when thinking about inclusive schools and inclusive classrooms, we want to create environments and communities where students are represented, their culture, their interests, things like that, but they're more a part of the environment instead of the environment being thrown at them, for example. So some simple strategies that we can do, for instance, is at the start of the school year, having a classroom and having the students and the teacher come together with norms and commitments for the school year. That's a way to give voice to students so that they're able to advocate for the things that are important to them. And obviously, it makes it easier to gain buy-in from the students to meet these norms that you all committed to.
Absolutely.
Inclusive schools are great, not only for neurodivergent students, but for all students. Thinking about students with different levels of accessibility, whether they are in a wheelchair or they are visually impaired, or a student that has autism. It's creating intentional moments within a school and a classroom for students to learn and engage with each other, to collaborate, and to really be able to establish and recognize and use their voice.
Absolutely. And that's a great example for that. And I used to do that all the time when I taught, even at the high school level. And a lot kind of think, oh, we only have to do this with the little students. But even all the way, even through higher education, you have to establish that classroom, those norms and procedures, as well as the culture. And here, when we're saying the word culture, we're not identifying race or ethnicity. We're talking about the climate and the feel of that classroom environment. So some people kind of get that confused. But you also mentioned being neurodivergent, right? And a lot of people are like, well, what does that mean? And so when neurodivergent, just a lot of students who are autistic or have other intellectual impairments or disabilities may fall under that category. And so we see kind of a bigger rise in what is called neurodiversity within programming, and how to support that. And so just a little bit of education on that. Neurodiversity is a framework for understanding human brain function and mental illness. And as you said, kind of post-COVID, it has been very much exacerbated in the classroom, both from the teacher and administrative lens, as well as the student. So it's really important to understand our children, either through social emotional learning tools and strategies, as well as, these classroom management and inclusive practices in the classroom.
I think one thing, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead.
a little bit, but one thing I just want to avoid us aligning neurodivergence with mental illness, or thinking that students cannot or do not have something, or something's wrong with them.
Right.
When thinking about neurodiversity, it can be students that, run the gamut, right? They can have a lot going on, a little bit going on, but it's the appreciation that we all learn differently and that our brains
Yes.
work differently.
Yes.
A starting point for us to figure out what folks need to be successful.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for saying that. Because yes, and I think we all process stuff a little bit differently, right? And we definitely obtain information differently. And kind of we can think about this a little bit in simpler terms of being, what type of learner are you? Are you a kinesthetic learner? Do you like the hands-on, those kids that like sensory play? Are you a visual person? For me, I'm visual. I have a really interesting picture memory. Like, I know I seen something because I read it, type of thing, or, can follow my directions back because I visually seen where I went, right? Or you have somebody that is an auditory learner who hears things and can obtain that information very clearly. And so just like we all learn in those ways, our brain obviously processes things in different ways. So like you said, to be respectful of just the different learning styles and just how our brains work, because they're very interesting and every person is so unique.
Yeah.
And I do feel that, that can be a struggle for a lot of teachers that just doesn't, they kind of see things one way, or they learn and do in one manner and don't know how to kind of switch that over to work with the students and their best ways of learning and I guess demonstrating how they learn. So what is some strategies that you like to use when you're kind of coaching those classrooms in working with that terminology, or just some strategies in those areas?
Definitely. So I have this living document of differentiation strategies. What I found throughout my career is that when educators hear the word differentiation, they get scared. They're like, oh my goodness, that seems like a big thing. What do I do? I don't have a SPED certificate. Like, how do I go about this? And so by doing this weekly document, I add 2 different differentiation strategies every week, so that educators can, one, identify the ways in which they're already differentiating content, process, or products, but also give them new ideas of things they can try to reach students. And so thinking about the use of graphic organizers is something that's pretty easy that people don't realize is a differentiation strategy. Or if you have students of different reading levels, if you can find the text on different levels, that's another way of differentiation, where you're giving students access to the material so that they're able to read it where they are and still participate in larger group conversations. I think about differentiation strategies such as providing sentence stems or pre-teaching vocabulary that both support students with disabilities, but also multilingual learners, which is, we know that the populations across the country has increased given the number of immigrants that are coming now. And so my goal is to make differentiation easy for teachers, to say, start with one thing a week, start implementing it, and then build on from there. I think that's how you become a really, really strong special education teacher, but just a good teacher. I believe that good teaching is good teaching, and good teaching encompasses the ideals of special education because it benefits all learners, not just those with IEPs, especially since we know that there are a ton of students that may not qualify for an IEP, whether they're on the cusp or there's cultural barriers that we can't get consent. I think it's just important that as educators, we're all learning these different strategies and techniques to reach our students.
Yeah, and that's a great point. There's so many people unidentified with, if they are special needs or not. And again, it is important, like you mentioned, to understand, again, everybody learns different, but it doesn't mean necessarily just from the special ed stance. And, that's the field that you work in. And so for me as a parent of 2 children who do receive special education services, primarily my son, who he has high functioning autism, and then my daughter, she has ADHD, but they kind of very much, autism is a full spectrum for those that do not know, and it looks very much different in every student and every person. And I've been told so many times, like, oh, I would never know that he was autistic. And I'm like, yeah, because it's not, always a straightforward telltale sign. But as somebody, for me as an educator and somebody who learned about, some of the indicators that may kind of point in that direction for him, I definitely had to advocate that I knew that my son, was autistic and he needed some additional support. So I'm kind of gonna go on a little bit of a, parents, make sure that you understand that you know how to get your child those services, and to advocate if you have a concern for your child's learning abilities or capabilities. And if you feel that things aren't just connecting the right way, that you have the right as a parent to ask for formal evaluations of your child, as well as making sure to connect with your pediatrician and somebody that can make sure that they get them formally assessed and do do, those formal assessments. And it is a process. Believe me, it is a process. But from the parents' side of view, once we have had things established for him, and everybody's on the same page, and we can, the earlier they're getting those supports, the better off they are. Because I've seen some high school students when I was teaching that just never got anything and any help, and they're just struggling. But again, to the flip side, we all do not need to push students into special education because not every child needs it. And
Certainly.
so, yeah.
And I think that's interesting. So I'm working currently with my job to build out our multilingual department. And
Okay.
between there and other schools, the number of students that are not English speaking as their primary language, that is inaccurately identified for needing special education services when nothing else is going on, they just can't speak English. So I
Isn't that
think it's
interesting?
really, really important that we are going through this RTI process, response to intervention, to identify the students that really need it. And even if, students don't qualify, doesn't mean that they might not need a certain number of extra supports during a certain math unit or during a certain science unit. And I think that really speaks to the transition of many schools to adopt multi-tier systems of support, MTSS, where we are giving students exactly what they need, regardless of if they have an IEP or not.
Right. Yes, and that's a good topic that you brought up too, with the the English language learners, because here in our state, it's kind of a push to remove dual language out of our schools, which isn't a direction I feel is beneficial to a lot of students. But I have heard that in the past. My child has been identified as special education, but that's because the language barrier. And again, schools need to be able to have a way to support those that do not primarily speak English in their households, and then also be very careful with placing unnecessary labels on a child if they don't need that. Because like you said, it's just the language. They're capable if they were at home learning and doing in their own native tongue, and versus having to transition it and learn something different here. So it doesn't mean that they are in need of those types of services.
And
So
I
that's
think,
great.
yeah, definitely. And I think in general, like as a rule of thumb, when thinking about referring a student for special education, I feel like there's always some core questions that you should review. And one of them being like, has the student, is the student underperforming because they've never been taught the material? Has their previous instruction not been quality? That's why they're underperforming. And is their language serving as a barrier? And I think when using that and looking at the data helps folks make more informed decision.
Yeah.
And also something that you mentioned about overclassifying students. I really want to emphasize parents seeking advocates to help them go into these meetings. Sometimes when going into schools and going to special education meetings, there's a lot of terms and jargon that's used. And,
Yes.
we want to assume that schools have our best interests in heart and our students' best interests at heart. But as we know, in much of education, things derive from systematic racism. We just want to be vigilant, right? And I think about students that, specifically Black boys, that are overclassified as being emotionally disturbed, or as they it recently as being emotionally dysregulated, specifically if they have, other classifications that they can meet the needs of. And so I think that's something that I'm really passionate about, is like not being very cognizant about the classifications that we give our students to ensure that they get the supports.
Yes. Yeah. And I kind of want to, put a bug in your ear that those that don't know, a lot of things around special education is funded, is money funded, like it's funded. And so what I've learned, especially working in other systems, is that people abuse labeling students as special education. Why? Because their school then gets more funding for these children. And so definitely being very careful of it. And I've also, unfortunately seen it from the parent side. I've known of students that their parents swore up and down there was something wrong with them, just to kind of get a check at the end of the day for Social Security. And and it's kind of the world we live in, and it could be for many reasons, but again, there's usually dollars that are attached to a child that has that label. But again, utilize it if you need it, because it's there, especially if you're in the public education system. They are supposed to support you, and they are supposed to do right by your child. I'll give kind of an example, for my son, again, even for my daughter. But I think what ends up happening, especially with our boys, our Black boys, what ends up happening with students or any student with special education is people tend to lower the bar for them or make excuses for children who are labeled as special education, because they think that they cannot, or they struggle to push them a little bit harder to kind of excel a little bit better in their academics, when they are very much capable of as much. You just have to do that. You just have to be the person to push that on them. And so I had transferred my children who were in a small charter that I used to run with me, but we had transitioned back into public school. And I had to say, kind of right in our very initial meeting for his IEP, to say, hey, yes, he's a year behind academically, but please be sure he is getting that full group instruction for his on grade level content. Please be sure because what the big thing now is the reading levels, and a lot of the school libraries do not let kids check out books that are higher reading levels than what they're labeled as being able to read as. Where I know my son, who pushes back with reading, he despises it, but he actually loves reading. He loves comics. It just depends on what's in front of his face, right? And so he used to get kind of like easier, like younger level material, and he would be like, I don't want to look at this. This is for babies. Like, I don't want this. And so he would completely disengage because the content wasn't, in his mind, something that he should be receiving, but on an academic level it was appropriate for him. And so I would have to push, to say, hey, please make sure that if he wants a higher level book, just give it to him, because we can teach them the words. It's about visual, it's about repetition, and access to higher level content. And if we don't give it to them because we think they can't handle it, they're never going to be able to excel past what they're kind of at that time. So I definitely, as a parent and as an educator, like, encourage you guys to do that. What are some, what's a couple other trends, I suppose, that you've noticed in the last couple of years doing what you're doing, especially post-COVID? That's some struggle areas or some areas to kind of work in special education or education in general.
Definitely. I feel right now behavior is a pretty hot topic where, again, because we have a lot of new educators that are still learning how to be good teachers, their behavior management strategies isn't always all the way there yet. And so they're receiving students that have some high needs, with certain disabilities or disorders, such as autism or oppositional defiance disorder, ODD, or ADHD, right? Yeah. And this actually leads to, on March 13th, I'm hosting a free webinar for educators and parents, anyone who wants to join, specifically looking at those three disorders, to one, understand what it looks and sounds like in the classroom. And then as adults, what can we do to best support and respond to students when they're, acting in a way that is a manifestation of their disability. And so I think about something as simple as like ADHD, right? Where students may be fidgety, they may appear to be daydreaming in class, they may be disorganized, and identifying ways as educators that we can, one, create structure and routine for them. I'm really excited about the webinar, because I think it's going to share some really concrete strategies with teachers and with parents. Thinking about even autism, conveying the importance of consistency and structure with students. How, yes, they might show some harmful behaviors to themselves or others, but that doesn't mean that you don't respond and correct them, right? Like you need to them and have patience. Thinking specifically about ODD, oppositional defiance disorder. A lot of the time with new teachers, it's like you have to avoid the power struggle. You state that you want them to do, and you give them time to do it. But you can't go in the back and forth with the student, because the student will And
Oh,
you
absolutely.
so you say what you need to say and then you keep it pushing. But these are things that just once you're in education for a while, you start to develop on your own. But I'm finding that a lot of newer educators are just needing more help. And I think the other piece
Yeah.
to behavior management is consistency. I think that's sometimes
Mm-hmm.
else where we fall short, where we'll do it for 2 days and then stop, or we'll do it sometimes, but not other times. And it's like you have to do it the same way all day, every day.
Mm-hmm.
Students will definitely hold up their end of the bargain.
Oh, absolutely. And you made me think of my kids and all of that statement, kind of starting with my son, again, that he has been identified with ODD, the oppositional defiance disorder. And that was a big thing. And for him, that power struggle and pushback. And as a mother and as a parent, and that's kind of, when we talk about discipline and we talk about respect for, adults or your parents or whoever's taking care of you, that can be hard with the child, and especially with the littles. I kind of in the back of my head is like, okay, he'll phase out of it a little bit, as he gets older. But like you said, the consistency is key. And I think another really big piece is understanding a little bit of the child's home life, because from, with my son, he's with me half the week and then with his dad half the week. And so that meant a lot of getting his dad and I on the same page, but then his dad, I, and the school on the same page with how we now handle his behaviors. When is it appropriate to call us? When you're not going to call me every 5 seconds every time something happens. Like, what are you going to do? And then also, if you know of those strategies that work for your child, if you're doing the work at home, making sure that those schools know that. But then that consistency, especially with a child with autism, can be it has to be very important. And I know that it's a struggle because most teachers have about 30 kids on average in a classroom. So
Yes.
it can be hard to manage all at once.
Definitely. And I love that you brought in this collaboration piece. So when I was at the school that I co-founded, I started something called the Ujima Plan. And Ujima is a Kwanzaa principle that means collective responsibility. And so I would literally write this plan up and write very concretely what our goals were for behavior or academics, what was happening at school. I even, I'm a very type A person, but for teachers, like when a student does this, this is how you respond. If a student does this, this is when you tap in leadership. When a student does this, this is when you call parents. Because to your point, we're not bugging parents all day and stressing you all out. But after I come up with this plan, then we have a meeting on Zoom with mom, dad, auntie, uncle, all the people that are in the village that are working to support this student. And we come up with a list of tangible and intangible rewards to say that, okay, when you meet X, Y, and Z goal, that means at school, you will earn 5 minutes extras of recess. But when you're at dad's house, maybe you get to get ice cream. Or if you're at Mimi's house, then you get to do this. So I definitely really, truly believe and it takes a village to raise a child. And if we're not on the same page, the school and the home, nothing's going to get done.
Yes, absolutely. I swear, I feel like I'm looking at myself talking because that's exactly what I say. I say it to all the time. It has to. And in my past role with the charter school that I was working with, that was the big thing, was like really pushing the parents to be more involved in their child's education. But of course, at the end of the day, too, it is up to the educators. But it does, like you said, it takes a village. We all have to be hands-on because we hear all the time, like, my kids aren't learning anything and the school's not doing anything and like all the things, right? And then I want to turn around and be like, well, what are you doing? Because if you're still complaining about that, have you took the step to now go and talk to them and advocate? And sometimes we know in the world that we're living in education that it's not a just and equal system still, all these years later. And you have to do a little bit more. And so finding those people that can help you advocate at a higher level if needed, because at the end of the day, it is our right to have public education and for our kids to get what they need. But then we still have to do fundamentally what we need to do as parents, or the guardians taking care of these children, because it's not all going to happen at the schools. It has to. We learn from home first. So that's kind of my narrative that I push. kind of backtracking to another thing that you said, and just to give an example and a story why I focus on cultural responsiveness, and then also with recognizing students with disabilities. My daughter, she has ADHD, and you mentioned, if the kid is kind of like in their own zone, not doing any or fidgeting and not messing around, right? So it's well known that my daughter has ADHD, but she's a more internal, and a lot of people think, oh, ADHD, they're just like hyper all over the place. My daughter is not physically hyper all over the place. She is internally in her brain all over the place. She is in her own little world 90% of the day, which I love. She is very creative and very intrinsically motivated for herself to do the things that she loves. But she can be in her own little world sometimes. And so, she told me a story recently that happened a couple of months ago where, it was silent reading time. Everybody was reading something in their book. And, she struggles with reading a little bit out loud, and so she was looking for something in her backpack, and the teacher, I guess, called her out and was like, hey, stop messing around. Well, since you want to mess around during silent reading, you're going to read this full page out loud to the classroom. And so, mind you, she's already has a 504 plan. So 504 plan, again, it's not as expensive as an IEP. For those that don't know, it's just really for those with ADHD or ADD, just needs minimal support. So she has a 504 plan. We already know she has some reading out loud issues, and we've already addressed these things. But you turned and tried to discipline her for not paying attention or doing what she's supposed to do by embarrassing her and making her read out loud. And she gets in the car and she's like, I had the worst day today. And I was like, what happened? And she told me, and she's like, and I was crying, and I don't, and I didn't like crying, and I was just really upset, and she made me read this really long page, and I was just embarrassed. And so when teachers do things like that to students, and I understand it could be a learning opportunity, but it's not a place and a time to insert your dominance and to also embarrass that child into enforcing them to do what you're trying to make them do, instead of working with her and talking with her, because now she's going to have that negative emotion to public speaking or outward reading or all of those things, where sometimes educators don't think about those little things that will have a long-term lasting effect on these children and their education. And that can be for anybody. And I know we all can think of that one time where you're like, dang, that really did stick with me all these years. And so I really encourage for educators to stay away from those types of tactics, because that hurts kids at the end of the day.
Yeah, I feel like it's a double-edged sword, right? I find that some people think that students with disabilities are allowed to kind of skate their way through and they don't receive consequences. But it has to be a balance, right? As an educator, it's to say that, hey, you should be reading right now, just to remind you, whatever you're looking for, you can look for it later. Maybe the average student gets one reminder and then a consequence. If a student I know has, intrusive thoughts and just distracted, I might give them 3 reminders and then a consequence. So it doesn't mean that they don't receive the consequence. It's me extending them grace, because I recognize that they can't help it. But then it also speaks to the importance of us as educators and parents, making sure that we're teaching students, one, how to advocate for themselves for what they need. And I loved it. A couple of months ago, I ran into a student in the hallway, and I was asking him, I'm like, oh, well, what's your teacher's name? And he was like, well, I have ADHD. I'm not good with names. So I can't tell you her name, but I can show you. And I'm like, I really respect that, because he knows what he's working with and able to advocate to say that, I don't have that for you right now. And I'm okay with that. So you need to be okay with that too, which I think
absolutely.
We got to make sure that we're teaching students about what works and doesn't work for them. So that way, when they go into spaces, they're able to say, hey, can I have, a visual anchor chart? Because that's how I learn best. Or, they get really distracted sometimes. Is it okay if you can remind me sometimes if I stay on focus? Because, it's better. And we're not, penalizing students and making them read and have a terrible day because that sucks.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly. And so I love that too. Again, the kids, knowing how to advocate for themselves and speaking up, and that it all comes with the learning tools. And again, I think for us, we're like, yeah, that's simple. Just teach them, but we know that it's kind of hard to get people to kind of get in that mindset to do it. So again, this is why I love having these conversations, because it just kind of gives us more ideas of things that we need to be doing
Can I
there.
just
And I
add one
love
more
that you,
thing? I'm sorry.
yeah, absolutely. No, you're fine.
I also think it's important for us as adults to model these things we want to see.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so I love kindergartners. Like, I feel like either people love kindergarten or hate kindergarten. I'm the person that love it. They come in like knowing nothing and leave kindergarten as like real humans. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But in that, they're still trying to understand their emotions. Really, all they know is happy, sad, and and so
Yeah.
modeling for them to say, okay, you're angry right now. That's okay. But
Hmm.
we don't throw crayons when we're angry. We don't hit our friends. You can feel
Right.
angry and
Yeah.
process and have your moment, and then let's talk about it together. Or as a
Yeah.
teacher, if we're all human, and let's say for whatever reason you're fussing at your kids, to say, I'm sorry, I should not have raised my voice at you, but I felt upset because you all did X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And I think that's really
Absolutely.
important for us, especially as we're moving into, gentle parenting, and I like to call gentle teaching the restorative practices, right? We
Yeah.
have to model for our students the skills that we want them to be able to implement themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely agree 100% with that. And that, ties along with the social emotional learning aspect of education, and both, from the teaching and the student side. I'm just curious for you guys in New York, what does that look like currently for you with the field of social emotional learning? Because here, like I said earlier, it's kind of starting to be taken away out of education for a negative implication onto behavior, which I don't agree. But how is it going out there for you guys?
I would say in New York and New Jersey, definitely still implementing social emotional learning curriculum. Um,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of schools are implementing more restorative practices instead of punitive
Mm-hmm.
practices, which is really good.
Yes.
And I think it's just a response to what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Understanding that different students come from different backgrounds and different home environments, and they don't have that opportunity to know that it's okay to cry sometimes, or
Right.
they think that they can't be mad. No, yes, you can be mad, right? You have the right
Yeah.
to feel, and you can feel the way you feel. But I used to tell my students, okay, all the time, like, I understand you're sad, but you're still going to get this work done. You can be sad and work.
Yeah, absolutely. I just saw a post that was like, you can't teach a child how to manage emotions that they're not allowed to have. And I was like, that's a very great point. And we know in certain communities it's very frowned upon to be sad and negative and all these things, and so I find it very interesting. But the restorative practices, I love that, especially at the high school level. That was a very great model that I seen when the students are kind of stepping in to kind of help solve these problems in between students, but as well as teachers. Like if teachers are having issues with the students, then you're kind of more talking it out instead of, oh, you disrespected me, I'm going to write you on a referral and keep going, right? And then you get into that cycle of why kids are being suspended and expelled out of school, which is another topic for another day. But so it's so important. It's so important that we're focused on all of these things. And I love that you're offering these supports to the schools, especially for special education, which across the country is a very high need. Again, as we mentioned, a lot more students and people are being identified as with special education or as needing special education services, and so we don't have as many people entering the field to kind of cover these positions, paraprofessionals or anybody that's actually certified in mental health and all of these things. I'm just curious, within your charter that you did you guys implement a behavioral like therapist or counselor or anything like that?
So we had a social worker and school counselor um, that would provide services. Um, it really depends on the city and state. So in New
Yeah.
York City, all of the charter schools are within the district. We're kind of like
Okay.
stepchildren.
Yeah.
In New Jersey, for instance, our charter school is our own LEA. So we're our
Okay.
own district within itself. So we are in the process of hiring oh goodness, I'm drawing a blank. The
It's
behavioral
okay.
technicians and
Oh,
all
okay, gotcha.
BCBAs. But the fact of the matter, the BCBAs, speech therapists, occupational therapists, there's also a shortage in that. Like, so there's a lot of
Yes,
students across the country that are not getting the services that they need, or they're still getting
absolutely.
virtual services, which speech and
Yes.
works, OT is a nightmare.
Now, listen, my son receives speech therapy ever since kindergarten, and during the pandemic, when he had to get virtual speech lessons, that yeah, it was hard, and especially as a kid who hates being at school but on a computer, that was a nightmare. But now having those services in person, it's so much better. But yes, that shortage is unfortunate, because the last person was like in a whole different state. Like, so it's, and these people are, bogged down with 50, 60 students, and trying to, and as if anybody knows, if you are handling these many kids at one time, it's hard to kind of keep track of where they're at, and and to really have a very effective way to work with them, because you're now having to go back and look at notes and like remembering where you left off. And yeah, so thank you for bringing those up, because those specialty, especially the occupational therapists, those specialty roles, definitely need to be strengthened here as well. All right. So my last question of our day here. So I'm just curious. I have kind of already asked, like, your thoughts on some things that we need to do a little bit better. In what ways do you feel maybe that districts or schools should support the teachers to kind of better help these efforts in strengthening these areas in education?
I think special education teachers, small group teachers, however they coin it, learning specialists at their school need more development. We are often the only group within the school that is often left to our own devices until there's a problem. A lot of special education leaders are really strong in compliance, but not necessarily in instructional development. And so our learning specialists and special education teachers aren't getting that feedback and development in order to push their practice to best serve students. And so I think we should prioritize funds to bring in outside folks to do training and feedback cycles with our teachers, not even just for our special education teachers, but something that can benefit all teachers in the school. I think it's something that we should definitely prioritize as a field, to ensure that, we're putting our best foot forward for our students.
Yes, definitely agree. My last kind of the last I went to an IDEA conference for special education, and and I don't know if you noticed this, but what I noticed that we tend to do a lot, especially around professional development, is we talk about the topics all day long and we know what the issues are, but there's no like active movement to actually change some of these things that we're doing. We're just sitting here talking about the same topics. Like, yes, we know we need to work on inclusion and diversity with special education. We know that we need to get better in these things, but it's all talk and no like action behind it. And so I'm curious, is there, you have any thoughts on like how we can get the action actually going, or, an example of something really good that you saw that's action based and not just talking the talk?
Definitely. So in my experience of working across states, so I've worked in New York, with educators in New Jersey, Chicago, DC, New Orleans. I feel like those are the major ones. Special education has nuanced differences in each state, which is crazy to think, considering that it's a federal program. And so even thinking about in the state of New York, the New York City IEP looks different from the IEP in upstate New York, because I have a school in Poughkeepsie. And so figuring out how we can streamline more of these systems beyond just, the law. So that way we can ensure streamlining services when students move states, especially in a post-COVID world as people are migrating south. I think is one. I think the other is a similar approach to TFA, right? Where they are finding people to get interested in teaching, not necessarily to be long-term teachers or long-time teachers, but for them to understand a small plight of urban education and what we go through, educators, students, and families, so that then they can go into their fields of law or policy or business and understand and then advocate for us as well. So I think
Wow, that's a
we
great
have to
example.
make sure that everybody knows what's going on, why it's important, how it can benefit us all. And then once we all start talking about it, then we'll see the growth that we need to make. Right now, unfortunately, special education is still an afterthought most often in districts and schools.
Yeah.
But, day by day, we're going to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I loved all of that. I'm going to stop talking for today because I'm going to keep you on all night long, and we've already been going past our time. But thank you so much, Diana. I really appreciate everything that you shared with me, and I would love to have you back on. We can elaborate on some more of our topics that we kind of came up with today. So again, for those that are watching, please be sure to follow Diana. She is on her LinkedIn account, which has all of her information. I already signed up for her workshop on the 13th. I'm looking forward to listening to that on your Zoom call, and just a bunch of other resources that you share. So again, thank you for supporting this community of students and being the educator that you are, and representing what is needed in our community. So I appreciate your time, and everybody, like, follow, and share, and give us a thumbs up, give us some comments on this video, and thank you. You guys all have a good night.
Thank you so much.